Well, you'll be glad you saw this. The UK right now is in serious need of a dose of sanity, and that's why Jordan Peterson's making airwaves for speaking some bitter truths to the British people. Just take a look at this exchange he had on GB News and you'll realize precisely why I say that.
I know that you're a great scholar of the Soviet Union. Do you believe Britain, and more broadly the West, maybe countries like Canada, are going down that path towards the Soviet Union? Do you see any similarities there between the left-wing authoritarianism of that system?
Well, I think the similarity is the false signaling of virtue, which is very much characteristic of tyrannical movements in general. The sacrifice of individual liberty for a fictitious common good that never makes itself manifest and that is delusional to begin with. And the insistence on centralized top-down state control, which is technically absurd. I mean, economists like Hayek, they basically got their analysis of the free market correct from a technical perspective. The reason that central planning can't work is because there's no way central planners can ever gather as much information as individual consumers and producers have at their fingertips. It's like imagining that you could replace the internet with a single mainframe. It's complete insanity. And so they're similar in that regard, this belief in central planning. Yes.
Nobody could have put a finger on that core pathology of the far left better than this, and let me tell you why. I think somewhere in the last century, left-wing movements starting in America and across the Western world morphed from being pro-working class to a crude ideology worshipping centralization of government and collectivization of the people on an identity basis, and then today almost all of the UK's current headlining problems are downstream from that. The utopian net zero ideologies tell you that if you just give up some more individual liberties to the politicians, that government can save the planet for you. The woke censorship crowd wants you to shut up and cancel yourself if you offend the sensitivities of the crowd, and even the scandal of the UK government covering up assault cases of young girls is because the politicians in charge cannot separate the crime from the race or national origin of the criminal and would rather just remain quiet to not offend the multiculturalists. But now all of those lies have started to catch up because it's time to go back to the individualist tradition that finds its roots in Great Britain itself.
You don't get a set of attributes that are positive without getting the shadow. The shadow for leaders is always narcissistic self-aggrandizement and entitlement. And it's often very difficult for the average voter, let's say, to tell the difference between the people like Trudeau, who are actors of their own delusion, and the genuine article, right? We tend to read confidence as competence, and the reputational game, the reputational hierarchy can be gamed. How do you protect against that? Well, I think the most fundamental protection is that you get involved in the political process, right? You have to stabilize, you have to adopt political responsibility within the confines of your own life if you're going to escape from the grip of tyranny. It's always been that way. It'll never change. You can't turn it over to the distant leaders. It'll never work, not least because you fall into the hands of narcissistic tyrants.
That is such a powerful thought because I think by politics, Jordan means something much more proximal to your own life than the abstract and far-removed political tussles going on in the halls of government. The number one thing that a tyrant fears is strong population with a thinking brain and the ability to communicate and organize. That's why the first thing a tyrant does is take away your right to free speech and your ability to physically defend yourself, and these first few steps of tyranny are often so small that they're easy to pass off for the greater good, which is exactly what we've seen happening before in places like the US, Canada, and even the UK. But is there a balancing act in that fight? Watch how Jordan Peterson put it, because I think we here in America could be facing that question very soon.
There's a lot of talk at ARC about liberalism and defending classical liberalism. That's what Kemi Badenoch said this morning.
Yeah.
I want to quote to you Donald Trump, who was echoing the words of Napoleon. He said, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." I want you to analyze that quote. Do you agree with Donald Trump that in order to deal with the kind of woke mind virus, to deal with how wokeism has taken over the government and the state, we have to use perhaps some alternative methods, every single lever of power available to him to do that?
Well, I always think that policy formulated as power is always suboptimal. you want to formulate policy as invitation, and you don't want to use fear. And you act in haste and repent at leisure. Now, I would take what Trump said in that regard with a grain of salt, like you take everything that Trump says with a grain of salt, because he's very good at big picture analysis and impulsive at the level of detail. So I don't see any indication at the moment that he's exceeded the rule of law in his attempts to set things right. Now there's a battle, and there are judges, for example, who've put up hypothetical constitutional barriers to the moves he's making with Musk, but my sense of that at the moment is those objections are pretty formulaic and weak, and I don't believe that I don't think there's any evidence that what Trump is doing is violating any of the laws that have to prevail if we're going to have rule of law.
So you don't see him as an authoritarian figure? I know some on the left
I don't think so.
accuse him of being Hitler.
Yeah, but for the radical leftists, everybody's Hitler. I was Hitler when I wasn't being a Jewish shill. It just gets tiresome.
Honestly, that's the most tired trope in American politics that not even people on the left are buying anymore, and much like many other paradoxes, people that draw comparisons between Donald Trump and fascist dictators of the past don't even care that the biggest characteristic of a fascist is that he consolidated more power in the government rather than cutting it down. If you really want to see what authoritarianism looks like, watch for the erosion of your freedom that's quietly happening under the most moral pretexts, with Canada's Bill C-16 mandating the use of gender pronouns, or with the Climate Change Committee advising the UK government that citizens should be made to cut down on meat consumption to save the planet and reach a net zero target. And in some sense, all of these things are symptoms, not the cause. The root cause of all this is the insistence on seeing people on a collective basis and then requiring those people to slowly give up their individual rights for the sake of that collective. That's exactly what we see reflected in the cover-up of the assault scandals in the UK, when it should have been treated as any other crime to the full extent of British law.
The woke cancellation mob is no joke, and it's definitely the case that people who were likely to stand up and make a case for the ethnic identity of the gang perpetrators were going to get sliced into ribbons. But what they don't understand, the people who remain silent, is that what the people who remain silent and complied don't understand is they're going to get sliced into ribbons for their silence too. There's no way out. The traditional injunction is that there is no better pathway forward than the truth. Now that does not mean that you won't suffer for telling the truth, but what it does mean is you'll also suffer for lying, and the suffering will be maybe deferred, but totalitarianism is deferred suffering. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's like we can lie now, and what? Get away with it? No, we turn the future into hell. Right. Lies turn the future into hell.
This really put into perspective for me something that too often gets lost in the haze of our surface level politics, and it's incredible how many problems go away the moment that you start treating people as individuals with their experiences, rights, and duties rather than a cog in a collectivist machine. But let me know what you thought about this conversation, because I think it's a fascinating insight into how valid that individualist tradition is even today.